Welcome to the color tutorial for Digital Anarchy's ToonIt photo plugin. I'm Jim Tierney, president of Digital Anarchy, and in this video I will discuss how ToonIt translates your photograph into distinct regions of color, creating that great cartoon look. The flat shading is really what sells the visual effect of the ToonIt cartoon, so let's get started in learning how to control your colors. So in this case I'm in Photoshop, and of course ToonIt is a Photoshop plugin. And so you can go up to the filter menu and go down to the Digital Anarchy submenu and apply ToonIt. Most cartooning software has difficulty tuning a human face, but definitely not ToonIt. So this close-up is perfect to experiment with. The ToonIt interface opens up and a cartoon effect is applied immediately to our photograph. The style controls along the right here set the type of shading algorithm used by ToonIt and gives you the option to control the appearance and behavior of the cartoon with the various parameters that you see right here. And of course each different style has its own separate set of parameters, but we're going to work with flat shaded. Simplicity here sets up the number of color regions that the image breaks down into. So if you have a lower simplicity value, you're going to get a more detailed image than you would with a higher simplicity value. Now this can be really great for images that have a lot of smaller objects, a lot of details. It doesn't work out so well for faces. You end up with a very posterized type of look, and usually setting simplicity to a much higher value is going to give you a little bit better results. And we're going to set this to 20, which is the default value for this. So now that we've got simplicity set up, let's take a look at flatness. If we set flatness to a high value, you can see that the color regions really have a sharp edge where they transition. And this creates a much more of a posterized look. And if we take flatness and drop it down all the way to around, say, 5, you're going to see that we're going to have a much smoother transition between those color fields. It's not quite as perfectly cartoony as the posterized look. But if we set this down to a little bit lower, you can see that we end up with a nice transition while still maintaining most of that flatness, but we don't have that extreme edge between the color regions. And that's going to give us actually a really nice cartoon image. So let's take a look at another style of color shading that's in the Style Creator. And when I choose that style from the pop-up, you can see that our cartoon shifts pretty noticeably. Flat Detailed keeps the shaded look of flat shaded, but the results preserve more overall detail and add in more dark and light contrast. This gives the image a heavier, more detailed look, much like a more traditional rotoscope style because of the added depth from the contrast. Let's take a look at the two settings that Flat Detailed has. Strength controls the definition between the dark, midtone, and highlight segments. The higher this value is, the more distinct the darks and lights will be from each other. If we crank strength up to 100, you can see how that affects the image, producing these very contrasty areas. If we lower strength down, going all the way down or leaving it around, say, 20, then the darks and lights become more blended together and the woman's face gets lighter overall. So let's set the strength to around 50. So now if we take a look at level, which is the other parameter in Flat Detailed, but level controls the shape of the color regions that make up the shadows and highlights. If level is high, the shadows become larger and more pronounced. When I change levels to a lower value, then the shadows get smaller and narrower, and you can see that's what happens when I set the value to 0 or something like 20. So you can see that Flat Detailed still keeps that cartoon look, but adds in just a little bit more detail. So it kind of creates more of a graphic novel type of a look than, say, a Sunday cartoon look, which would be much more flat shaded and, and use the flat shaded style in the Style Creator. So we can briefly take a look at some of the other settings that we have here. We can go down to stuff like bristle and droplet, which start creating more of a painterly feel. You have a brush size here, and you can start playing around with that and start really creating stuff that looks more like a painting than it does a flat shaded cartoon. And so there's lots of different ways of playing around with these controls and the different parameters that you have here. But in this case, we are really going for a flat shaded look, so I'm going to reset the ToonIt interface. And this is going to take us back to flat shaded with the default parameters. And this is giving us a pretty good look, but we're going to play around with the main blur, which really has a huge effect on any of the style parameters. The main blur is essentially a pre-blur. It gets applied to the image before the outlines or the style gets applied to it. And so the more blur you have on the image, as you can imagine, the less distinct the areas are. So that the areas that are very distinct, like for example her shoulder and the background, become very pronounced relative to the other areas which start blurring out tremendously. And so there's two parameters for main blur. There's the radius, which is essentially the blur amount, which you're probably all familiar with if you use something like Gaussian blur filter or smart blur or something like that. And then there's the threshold. And so the threshold is really looking at the image, analyzing it, and asking us how much of the image do we want to apply the blur to. Are we only looking for the faintest edges that will be blurred out? For example, you might have edges around the nose, and if I really crank the threshold down, you'll start to see some of those edges being picked up. If I crank it up, it's now going to start blurring out more and more of the sharper edges. So the edges that have more of a contrast between them. So if I set threshold all the way up, you'll see that it really starts to blur these regions together. You're losing a lot of the detail that was present when I had it set way down. And you really notice this in the hair. Right now I've got, with a very low threshold, I've got a lot of detail in the hair. As I crank the threshold up and the blur gets applied to more and more of the image, you'll really see the detail in the hair get lost. And so this is just with a minimal blur of around 3, and you can see what happens when I crank the radius all the way up to create a really large blur that's now being applied to the whole image due to the high threshold, and you're going to see things really start to blur out. Now in some cases, for some of the painterly styles, this works out pretty well, but for doing cartoon looks, usually you want to have the radius set to around 2 or 3 and have a threshold that's somewhere between 10 and 20. So we're just going to set it back to its defaults. That's going to give us some good definition in the color regions, which will produce nice outlines. And outlines also uses the blur, as you may have noticed. But you can see that there's an outline blur here as well. So you can have a separate blur going on for the outline and a separate blur going on for the color regions that are affected by the style that you've selected in the Style Creator. We can turn the outlines off and just see the underlying image. And so in this case, let's just crank this up to a pretty high amount. We're going to get the underlying color regions pretty blurred out. And we'll use the outline blur. And we're going to set this to a much lower amount. So while the color regions are going to be pretty blurred out, we're going to have a lot of detail in the outlines. So when I go back to the Outlines tab and turn off Outlines Only to blend the two together again, you can see that we still have a very nice image. So these are some of the ways that you can play around with the color controls in the outlines and using the blurs to influence the look of the image. And that basically concludes my tips for using ToonIt's colors and blur effects. I'll click the OK button to render this cartoon back out into Photoshop. I would like to thank you for joining me in this tutorial of ToonIt Photo. There are plenty more tutorials where that came from on the Digital Anarchy site. If you go to www.digitalanarchy.com, you'll find free demo filters, more presets, more tutorials, all the stuff that's available for download to help you get the most out of the ToonIt Photo plugin, regardless of whether you're in Photoshop, Photoshop Elements, or even Aperture. So stop on by the website and happy cartooning.